Shadow's fall into the pit began suddenly, a moment of fractured stability in an otherwise predictable survival routine. He had been cautiously sniffing through the damp, moss-covered floor of the valley, his ribs starkly outlined beneath his black fur, a testament to his constant battle with hunger. His sharp eyes scanned for movement, ears twitching at every faint rustle of leaves, hoping to find scraps or small prey. The terrain was deceptive. Lush grass concealed the weathered and rotting planks of an old hunting pit, abandoned and forgotten by time. Shadow's front paw pressed onto the fragile wood, and with a groaning crack, it gave way. The dog didn't fall immediately. For a moment, his claws scraped desperately at the splintering surface, instinct demanding escape. But the boards collapsed beneath his weight, sending him plunging into darkness. He landed heavily at the bottom, his limbs sprawled awkwardly in the damp mud. The wind was knocked out of him, and for several seconds, he lay still, his golden eyes wide and reflecting the faint light above. The air in the pit was thick with a damp, earthy stench, and Shadow's breaths came in short, panicked bursts as he tried to orient himself. He was surrounded by walls of slick, compacted mud that towered 12 feet above him. The surface was sheer and unyielding, the occasional root jutting out offering false hope. They were too fragile to hold his weight. Shadow's heart raced as he scrambled to his feet, mud clinging to his fur. He barked, a sharp, desperate sound that echoed back to him, hollow and mocking. The valley seemed to swallow his voice. Driven by instinct, Shadow began to claw at the walls. His paws, worn and cracked from years of surviving on the streets, worked frantically, dislodging clumps of wet dirt. His claws skidded over the surface, leaving long, shallow grooves that quickly filled again with mud as if mocking his efforts. Each attempt sent him sliding back to the pit's cold, unforgiving floor. His chest heaved, and he barked again, louder this time, the sound raw and filled with rising desperation. The world above was silent, indifferent to his plight. Shadow tilted his head back, staring up at the thin strip of sky visible through the opening. The light filtering down seemed cruel in its faintness, teasing him with its promise of freedom. Shadows of leaves moved lazily across the narrow beam, as if mocking the stillness below. He tried to leap, propelling himself upward with all the force his lean body could muster, but he barely cleared halfway before gravity pulled him down again. His hind legs buckled beneath him, sending a sharp jolt of pain through his joints. Mud clung to his fur in thick, cloying layers, weighing him down and sapping his already dwindling energy. His breathing became more labored as exhaustion set in, and his barks grew hoarser. Shadow was a fighter. He had survived countless nights of hunger, rain, and cold. But this was different. The walls of the pit loomed around him, a silent prison mocking his every attempt to escape. He paced the circumference of the pit, his head low, snout brushing against the mud as he searched for anything. A crack, a foothold, even the faintest scent of something other than the stale air and his own desperation. But the walls were featureless, worn smooth by years of rainwater cascading down their surface. His claws left faint marks that were quickly erased by the constant drip of moisture from above. Time seemed to stretch in the pit. Shadow had no way to measure it, no sense of how long he had been trapped. His once proud gait, the confidence of a dog who had navigated the harsh streets for years, was reduced to sluggish movements. His paws trembled as he tried once more to scale the wall, slipping and falling harder this time. He let out a low, defeated whine as he landed, his body splayed awkwardly in the mud. The pit's silence was deafening. Occasionally, the distant sound of a bird's call or the faint rustle of wind in the leaves would reach him, reminding him of the life continuing above while he remained forgotten below. He barked again, the sound weaker than before, the echo more pronounced. The walls seemed to close in, the narrow slice of sky above shrinking in his mind as despair began to take root. Shadow curled up against one of the walls, his body trembling as fatigue overcame him. The mud was cold, seeping through his fur and chilling him to the bone. His tail, once a proud plume of fur, now hung limply behind him, caked in dirt. He closed his eyes, but only for a moment. Every sound from above sent his ears flicking up, his head jerking toward the source, only for the hope to be dashed as silence returned. He was utterly alone. Shadow's thoughts, if they could be called that, were primal, driven by the instinct to survive. The scent of damp earth filled his nostrils, a constant reminder of his entrapment. Hunger gnawed at his belly, a familiar but now terrifying companion. He tried to dig into the floor of the pit, his claws scraping at the mud in a futile attempt to find something, anything, to distract from the hopelessness that threatened to consume him. He barked again, a sound that echoed into nothingness. His voice cracked and he whimpered, his head falling to rest on his forepaws. The black dog who had roamed the valley with such independence and resilience now lay broken, his spirit crushed by the unforgiving pit. Above, the day wore on, the light in the pit shifting slightly as the sun moved across the sky. But for Shadow, time had become meaningless, a stretch of endless, suffocating moments broken only by the faint glimmers of hope each sound from above would bring. Still, even as exhaustion overtook him, his ears remained pricked, his eyes glancing upward whenever a shadow passed over the opening. Shadow may have been trapped, beaten by circumstance, but some small part of him, a fragment of the scrappy stray who had survived against all odds, refused to surrender completely. He would bark again, scrape at the walls, and look toward the sky. Hope, however faint, was the only thing keeping him from succumbing entirely to the pit's cruel embrace. The night descended upon the valley like a suffocating shroud, the cold air sharp and heavy with silence. Shadow, lying in the mud at the bottom of the pit, had grown weaker with every passing hour. His black fur was soaked, his body trembling from a mix of exhaustion and the relentless chill. Every muscle ached, his paws throbbed from his futile attempts to claw his way out, and the hunger gnawed at him like a cruel phantom. Yet, his eyes still flicked upward, his ears pricked for the faintest sound, hoping, though barely believing, that someone or something might come to his rescue. But the sound that reached him next was not salvation. A low, guttural growl rolled through the stillness like thunder, sending a shiver down Shadow's spine. His head shot up, and his golden eyes widened as he caught sight of movement at the edge of the pit. A dark silhouette materialized, then another and another. 6 pairs of eyes gleamed down at him, reflecting the pale light of the moon like shards of ice. The air filled with the sound of heavy breathing, sharp and deliberate, as the creatures above circled the pit. They were lean, their ribcages pronounced beneath their fur, their hunger a visible and menacing force. The largest among them, an imposing black alpha with eyes that burned a malevolent yellow, stood at the edge of the pit, staring down at Shadow. His breath billowed in the cold air, and his lips curled back to reveal sharp, yellowed fangs. The alpha growled again, deeper this time, a sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath Shadow's paws. Shadow's body tensed despite his exhaustion. His hackles rose, and a growl rumbled from his own throat, weaker but defiant. He dragged himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him, and bared his teeth. The wolves did not recoil, they did not fear him. Instead, the alpha let out a sharp bark and the rest of the pack moved closer to the edge, peering down at their trapped prey. Their eyes glistened with hunger, their tongues lolling out as they panted. Shadow barked, a sharp, desperate warning that echoed up into the night. He lunged forward in a feeble attempt to appear stronger, snapping his jaws at the air. But his body betrayed him, his legs wobbling under the strain, and he stumbled back into the mud. The wolves above watched him, their heads tilting slightly as if they were mocking his efforts. They were patient. They could afford to wait. Shadow was trapped, and they knew it. They could smell his weakness, his desperation. The pack began to circle the pit more aggressively, their growls and barks blending into a cacophony that filled the night. The alpha wolf, his yellow eyes fixed on Shadow, took a step closer to the edge, his massive paws dislodging small clumps of dirt that tumbled down into the pit. Shadow flinched as one of the clumps struck him, the humiliation of his helplessness cutting deeper than the cold. He barked again, his voice hoarse and cracking, but the sound only seemed to amuse the predators above. They were toying with him. Shadow's mind raced, driven by both instinct and terror. He could not scale the walls, he had tried and failed too many times. He could not run, there was nowhere to go. His only option was to fight, but the odds were impossible. The alpha alone outweighed him, his sheer size and strength dwarfing Shadow's malnourished frame. And even if he somehow bested the leader, there were 5 more waiting to tear him apart. The wolves circling slowed, their movements deliberate, as if savoring the inevitability of their meal. Shadow snarled again, forcing his aching body into a defensive stance. His legs quivered beneath him, but he refused to show submission. He was a stray, a survivor who had faced the streets, hunger, and loneliness, but nothing had ever felt as hopeless as this. The humiliation of his entrapment stung almost as much as the wolves' ravenous stares. The alpha wolf lowered his head, his yellow eyes never leaving Shadow, and let out a low, resonant growl. The sound was a command. One of the smaller wolves, a wiry gray with a jagged scar across his muzzle, stepped closer to the edge, his claws scrabbling at the dirt as he leaned forward to peer down. Shadow lunged, snapping his jaws in a final act of defiance. The gray wolf recoiled slightly but quickly regained his composure, growling in annoyance. Above him, the alpha remained still, his gaze cold and calculating. Shadow's growls faltered for a moment as his strength waned. His breaths came in ragged gasps, his chest heaving as he tried to maintain his stance. The wolves above seemed to sense his growing weakness, their movements growing more confident, their growls deepening with anticipation. The alpha took another step forward, his massive body casting a long shadow over Shadow's trembling form. The humiliation was unbearable. Shadow, once proud and untamed, was now cornered, powerless, reduced to prey in the eyes of the predators above. His growls turned to whimpers as his legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed into the mud. The cold, wet earth seeped into his fur, weighing him down further, and his golden eyes flickered with despair. The pack watched him, their eyes gleaming with triumph. The alpha wolf let out a low, guttural bark, and the other wolves answered in unison, their voices blending into a haunting chorus that echoed into the night. They would wait, patient and unrelenting, for Shadow's strength to fade completely. Hunger had taught them the value of patience, and they would not waste their energy on a fight that would soon be unnecessary. Shadow's defiance, his growls and barks, were little more than noise to them now, a fleeting resistance that would soon be silenced. Shadow lay in the mud, his body trembling as the weight of his helplessness bore down on him. His golden eyes darted upward, watching the pack as they continued their macabre dance around the pit. He barked again, weak and hoarse, a sound filled with desperation rather than defiance. The wolves responded with mocking howls, their voices rising and falling in cruel harmony. And then silence. The wolves stopped moving, their growls fading into the stillness of the night. The alpha wolf stood motionless at the edge of the pit, his yellow eyes locked onto Shadow. The silence was deafening, a prelude to the inevitable. Shadow's body ached, his paws raw and bleeding, his breath shallow and uneven. Yet, even in his despair, a flicker of the stray's indomitable spirit remained. He raised his head, his lips curling back in a final snarl, his golden eyes burning with a defiance that refused to be extinguished. But the wolves were not done with him, not yet. They would wait, their patience as cold and unyielding as the night itself. They would let the pit do their work for them, let hunger and exhaustion sap the last remnants of Shadow's strength. And when the time came, they would descend, relentless and merciless, to claim their prize. The pit was a cruel stage, the wolves its audience, and Shadow its unwilling performer, a defiant, broken figure fighting against the inevitability of his fate. The night stretched on, the darkness pressing down, as the pack waited for their victory, and Shadow, battered and humiliated, prepared for one final stand. The night was dark and quiet, the faint hum of crickets filling the cool air. Jack Carter, a seasoned wildlife ranger with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face, was halfway through his evening patrol when he first heard it, the sound of barking, sharp and frantic, echoing through the valley. He slowed his four-wheeler, cutting the engine to better pinpoint the noise. It wasn't the usual sound of a territorial dog. It was different, desperate. A sound filled with fear. Jack adjusted the strap of his rifle and grabbed his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. He stepped into the dense underbrush, the ground soft and uneven beneath his boots. The barking grew louder, interspersed with growls and eerie howls that sent a chill down his spine. His pace quickened, the underbrush scratching at his jacket as he pushed through. When he reached the edge of the old hunting pit, the scene before him was grim. The wolves, 6 of them, circled the pit with predatory patience, their glowing eyes reflecting the moonlight. They were lean and feral, their ribs visible beneath their matted fur, hunger driving their every movement. At the bottom of the pit was a dog, a black stray, drenched in mud and trembling but still baring its teeth in a feeble attempt to defend itself. The dog's growls were weak, barely audible above the guttural snarls of the wolves. Jack's jaw tightened. He'd seen his share of cruelty in the wild, but this was different. The stray was cornered, hopeless, and the wolves were toying with it, savoring its inevitable collapse. Jack couldn't just walk away. He reached for his rifle, steadying the barrel as he aimed into the night sky. He pulled the trigger, the deafening crack of the shot splitting the air. The wolves froze, startled by the sudden noise. Then, as the echoes of the gunshot faded, they scattered, their tails tucked between their legs as they disappeared into the darkness. The largest of them, the black alpha, lingered for a moment, his glowing yellow eyes locking onto Jack's. It was a challenge, a silent assertion of dominance, but Jack held his ground, his finger resting firmly on the trigger. Finally, with a low growl, the alpha turned and slunk away, vanishing into the shadows. Jack exhaled, lowering the rifle, but the relief was short-lived. The stray was still in the pit, trembling and slumped against the muddy wall. Its golden eyes were wide with fear, darting between the retreating wolves and the figure of Jack standing above. Jack could see the dog was on the brink of collapse, its body thin and weak, its fur matted with mud and blood from its futile attempts to climb out. "Easy there, buddy," Jack muttered under his breath, kneeling at the edge of the pit. His voice was calm, low, the tone he used to soothe frightened animals. But the stray wasn't soothed. It growled weakly, its teeth bared in a last-ditch effort to protect itself. Jack couldn't blame it. He was a stranger, and the dog was trapped, humiliated by its helplessness. Jack reached for the coil of rope slung over his shoulder. He tied one end to the nearest tree, testing the knot with a firm tug, then tossed the other end into the pit. The rope landed with a heavy thud in the mud, inches from the dog. Shadow flinched, scrambling back against the wall, his paws slipping in the muck. Jack winced, realizing how terrifying the situation must be for the dog. "It's okay," he called softly, crouching lower to make himself seem less threatening. "I'm not going to hurt you. Just let me help." The dog didn't budge, its growls turning to low whimpers. Jack's heart sank. He could see the animal was too scared, too exhausted to cooperate. It didn't trust him, and why would it? Shadow's life had likely been one of abandonment and survival, with no reason to believe that a human would be any different from the predators circling above. Jack glanced back at the darkness beyond the pit. The wolves were gone for now, but they wouldn't stay away forever. He couldn't leave the dog here, not like this. His mind raced, weighing his options. He could climb down into the pit, but that carried its own risks. If the dog panicked, it might lash out, and Jack couldn't afford a bite or a scratch that could turn septic out here in the wilderness. Instead, he decided to try patience. He lowered himself to sit on the edge of the pit, letting his legs dangle into the void. He pulled a granola bar from his jacket pocket, unwrapping it slowly, the crinkle of the wrapper drawing the dog's attention. Jack broke off a piece and tossed it into the pit, watching as it landed a few feet from the dog. "Come on," he coaxed, his voice soft but steady. "You've got to be hungry." Shadow hesitated, his golden eyes fixed on the morsel. Hunger battled fear in the dog's mind, and for a moment, Jack thought it might not take the bait. But then, with a cautious step, Shadow crept forward, his movements slow and deliberate. He sniffed the granola bar, then snatched it up, retreating to his corner as he chewed. Jack tossed another piece, closer this time. Shadow eyed him warily but moved forward again, the food too tempting to resist. Bit by bit, Jack led the dog closer to the rope, his calm voice never wavering. "That's it," he murmured. "Good boy. You're doing great." Finally, Shadow was close enough to the rope. Jack leaned forward slightly, his hand brushing the coarse fibers. "Let me get you out of there," he said, reaching slowly. But as his hand extended, Shadow growled, his body tense and trembling. Jack froze, his hand hovering in the air. "I know," he said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. "I know you're scared. But you've got to trust me." The dog's growl softened, but the tension in his body didn't ease. Jack sighed, realizing he'd have to take the risk. He grabbed the rope firmly and began to lower himself into the pit, his boots sinking into the mud as he landed. Shadow snarled, scrambling backward, his golden eyes wide with panic. "It's okay," Jack said again, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you." The dog's growls faded into whimpers, its body pressed against the wall as Jack slowly approached. He crouched low, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The dog flinched as Jack reached out, but when his hand made contact with its matted fur, Shadow didn't bite. Instead, he froze, his body rigid beneath Jack's touch. "That's it," Jack whispered, his hand gentle as he stroked the dog's head. "You're safe now." The stray trembled but didn't pull away. Jack carefully looped the rope around its thin body, securing it just enough to lift without hurting it. He gave the rope a firm tug, testing the knot above, then stood, his boots slipping slightly in the mud. "All right, buddy," he said, gripping the rope tightly. "Let's get you out of here." With a grunt of effort, Jack began to climb, pulling the dog up with him. Shadow whimpered, his body swinging slightly as they ascended, but Jack held on, his arms straining with the weight. When they finally reached the top, Jack collapsed onto the ground, breathing heavily. Shadow lay beside him, too weak to move but finally free of the pit. Jack sat up, wiping the sweat from his brow. The dog's golden eyes met his, still filled with fear but now tinged with something else, perhaps a flicker of trust. For the first time that night, Jack allowed himself a small smile. Next spot. The night air was heavy with tension as Jack adjusted the rope tied securely to a sturdy tree near the edge of the pit. The dim light of the moon reflected off the slick mud walls below, where Shadow cowered. The stray's golden eyes glared up at Jack, filled with equal parts terror and defiance. His body trembled visibly, pressed hard against the pit wall as if hoping to disappear into it. Shadow's snarls were low and continuous, a desperate warning to keep Jack at bay. Jack crouched at the edge of the pit, his weathered hands gripping the rope tightly. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice calm and soothing, though his heart was pounding. The dog's growls deepened at the sound, his lips peeling back to reveal yellowed teeth. Jack could see the exhaustion in Shadow's every movement, how his legs trembled, how his sides heaved with labored breaths, but he also recognized the defiant spirit that refused to surrender. Jack took a deep breath and began lowering himself into the pit, his boots sinking into the muddy walls as he descended. The rope burned against his calloused palms, but he kept his movements slow and deliberate, not wanting to spook the frightened animal further. Shadow's growls grew louder as Jack neared the bottom, the dog baring his teeth and snapping at the air in warning. His paws clawed at the mud in a futile attempt to press himself further into the wall. "I'm not here to hurt you," Jack said softly, his voice steady despite the mounting tension. "I'm just here to help." Shadow's snarls wavered for a moment, a flicker of hesitation in his golden eyes, but his body remained taut with fear. Jack crouched low, careful not to make any sudden movements, and kept his gaze level, not direct eye contact, but enough to show he wasn't a threat. He extended a hand slowly, palm up, letting the dog see it clearly. Shadow snapped at the air, his sharp teeth clicking inches away from Jack's hand. The motion caused him to slide slightly in the mud, and he scrambled to regain his footing, his growls turning into panicked whines. Jack froze, giving the dog space to recover. "I get it," Jack murmured, his voice low and even. "You've been through hell, haven't you? But you're not going to make it out of here on your own. You need me." Shadow's growls softened into wary whimpers, his trembling intensifying as Jack edged closer. The ranger kept his movements fluid, maintaining a careful balance between caution and determination. His boots squelched in the thick mud with every step, and the cold, damp air pressed against his skin. He could see every detail of the stray's condition now, the scars crisscrossing his muzzle, the patches of fur missing from his flank, and the raw, bleeding pads of his paws from scraping at the walls. "You're a fighter," Jack said, inching closer. "I can see that. But even fighters need help sometimes." Shadow's eyes flicked between Jack's outstretched hand and the rope slung over his shoulder. His growls had almost entirely subsided, replaced by deep, shuddering breaths. Jack took another step forward, then lowered himself into a crouch, his body at the same level as the trembling dog. "Good boy," Jack whispered, his hand now just a foot away from Shadow's face. "That's it. You're okay." The dog's muscles quivered as Jack's hand inched closer. For a moment, it seemed as though Shadow might snap again, but then he froze, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed Jack's hand cautiously. His ears twitched back and forth, unsure whether to trust or retreat. Jack took the opportunity to reach for the rope. Moving slowly, he uncoiled it and formed a loose loop. Shadow flinched at the movement, his growls starting up again, but Jack spoke to him softly, never breaking the rhythm of his voice. "It's just a rope," he said gently. "Nothing to be scared of." It took several tense minutes, but Jack finally managed to slip the loop over Shadow's head. The dog froze as the rough fibers touched his fur, his entire body stiff with fear. Jack tightened the rope just enough to secure it without causing discomfort. "There we go," Jack said, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "You're doing great." Now came the hard part. Jack stood slowly, the rope taut in his hands, and tested the knot he had tied above. Shadow didn't resist, his strength was too far gone for that, but his eyes never left Jack, filled with wary distrust. Jack tugged on the rope, signaling to Shadow to move, but the dog didn't budge. He dug his claws into the mud, his trembling body rooted to the spot. Jack sighed, frustration gnawing at him. "I know you're scared," he muttered. "But we don't have time for this." With no other choice, Jack adjusted his grip on the rope and began to climb. His boots slipped against the muddy walls as he hoisted himself up, the weight of the dog dragging behind him. Shadow whimpered, his body swaying slightly as the rope lifted him off the ground. Jack gritted his teeth, his arms straining as he climbed inch by inch. The mud made the ascent treacherous, every step threatening to send him sliding back into the pit. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jack reached the top. With a final heave, he pulled Shadow over the edge, both of them collapsing onto the cold ground. Jack lay on his back, gasping for breath, his muscles burning from the effort. Shadow lay a few feet away, motionless except for the rise and fall of his chest. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The night was silent again, the wolves nowhere in sight. Jack turned his head to look at the stray. The dog was free, but his golden eyes still held the same guarded wariness as before. He stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him, and took a cautious step back from Jack. The rope still hung loosely around his neck, but he didn't try to bolt. "You don't trust me," Jack said, sitting up and wiping the mud from his hands. "I get it. But I just saved your life." Shadow didn't respond, his gaze fixed on Jack as if waiting for some hidden betrayal. His tail hung low, his body tense and ready to flee at the first sign of danger. Jack sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. He couldn't blame the dog for being cautious. It had probably been a long time since Shadow had known kindness. "You're free now," Jack said, his voice soft. "You can go if that's what you want. But if you stick around, I'll make sure you're fed. Maybe even give you a warm place to sleep." Shadow didn't move. He stood at a distance, his eyes wary, his body trembling from exhaustion and cold. Jack pushed himself to his feet, his knees aching from the climb, and took a step back to give the dog more space. "Your call, buddy," Jack said. "I'm not going to force you." Shadow's ears twitched, his gaze never leaving Jack. For a moment, it seemed as though he might take off into the night, disappearing back into the wild. But he didn't move. He simply stood there, watching, as if trying to decide whether to trust the man who had just pulled him from the brink of death. The ranch was shrouded in silence, save for the occasional creak of its old wooden structure as the wind swept through the wilderness. The property, once vibrant with life, now stood as a weathered memory of Jack's past. The main house had faded siding and a sagging roof, its windows dusty from years of neglect. The barn leaned slightly to one side, its paint peeling in long strips that revealed the raw wood beneath. Jack didn't mind the state of it. The ranch was functional, and tonight, it was a safe haven. Shadow limped behind Jack as they approached the front steps. The dog's legs trembled with every step, and his head hung low, but he stayed close, his golden eyes darting nervously toward the tree line as though expecting the wolves to reappear at any moment. Jack paused at the door, glancing back to see Shadow hesitating, his paws sinking slightly into the dirt. The dog's thin frame was silhouetted against the moonlight, his fur still matted with mud. "Come on," Jack said gently, holding the door open. "No one's gonna hurt you here." Shadow stared at him, his ears twitching at the sound of Jack's voice. For a moment, it seemed as though the dog might bolt, the wilderness calling him back. But then, slowly he stepped forward, his movements cautious and deliberate. His claws clicked softly against the wooden floor as he entered the house, his body tense and ready to retreat at the first sign of danger. Jack closed the door behind them and set his rifle down in the corner. The inside of the house was sparse, a few old pieces of furniture, a wood-burning stove, and a table cluttered with tools and supplies. Jack grabbed a blanket from the back of the couch and spread it out on the floor near the stove. "This'll do for now," he muttered, kneeling down to stoke the fire. The warmth began to spread through the room, chasing away the night's chill. Shadow sniffed the air, his nose twitching as he cautiously padded toward the blanket. He moved stiffly, his muscles clearly aching from days of strain and malnutrition. Jack watched him settle down, the dog's movements slow and deliberate as he curled into a tight ball. His golden eyes remained open, watching Jack warily. "Rest," Jack said softly, leaning back against the couch. "You're safe now." For the next few days, the ranch became a sanctuary for both of them. Jack divided his time between tending to the property and caring for the stray. Shadow's initial mistrust was evident in every interaction. He flinched at sudden movements, growled softly if Jack came too close, and refused to eat while Jack was in the room. But Jack was patient. He left food and water near the blanket, stepping back to give the dog space. On the second day, Shadow began eating regularly, though he still kept his eyes on Jack the entire time. His movements grew less sluggish as he regained his strength, the trembling in his legs subsiding. Jack noticed the dog's ribs weren't quite as pronounced anymore, the steady meals beginning to fill out his lean frame. By the third day, Shadow ventured closer. Jack had been sitting on the porch, repairing a broken wooden chair, when he felt a presence behind him. He turned to see Shadow standing a few feet away, his ears perked and his nose twitching. Jack held out a hand, a piece of dried meat resting in his palm. "Here," Jack said quietly, his voice calm and steady. Shadow hesitated, his golden eyes flicking between Jack's hand and his face. After a long pause, the dog stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. He sniffed the meat, then took it gently from Jack's hand before retreating a few steps to eat. Jack smiled, the small gesture feeling like a monumental victory. "Good boy," he said softly, watching as Shadow licked his chops. That evening, Jack decided it was time. The dog had regained enough strength to stand tall, his legs steady beneath him. Jack walked to the front gate, the old metal creaking as he unlatched it. He swung it open wide, the sound echoing across the empty fields. Shadow followed him to the gate, his head tilted in curiosity. Jack stepped aside, gesturing toward the open land beyond. The wilderness stretched out in all directions, the trees casting long shadows beneath the moonlight. "Go on," Jack said, his voice low. "If you want to go back, you're free to leave. No one's holding you here." Shadow stood at the threshold, his nose lifting to sniff the cool night air. The dog took a tentative step forward, his paws crunching against the frost-covered ground. He paused, his ears swiveling as he listened to the distant sounds of the wild, the rustle of leaves, the faint howl of wind. Jack watched in silence, his hands resting on his hips. For a moment, it seemed certain that Shadow would leave. The open land called to him, the instincts of a stray tugging him back toward the life he had known. But then he stopped, his body stilling as he turned to look over his shoulder. His golden eyes met Jack's, and something shifted in their depths, a flicker of emotion that Jack couldn't quite name. Trust, maybe? Gratitude. Shadow turned back, stepping away from the open gate. He padded toward Jack, his movements slow but deliberate, and stopped at the man's side. Then, to Jack's surprise, the dog lowered his head, pressing it gently against Jack's leg. The gesture was brief, tentative, but it carried a weight that Jack felt deep in his chest. Jack reached down, his hand resting lightly on Shadow's head. The dog didn't flinch this time, his body relaxing slightly beneath Jack's touch. "Well," Jack said softly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Looks like you made your choice." Shadow looked up at him, his golden eyes filled with something Jack could only describe as peace. The wild was still out there, vast and untamed, but Shadow had chosen differently. He had found something here, a home, a companion, a second chance. The gate creaked softly as Jack closed it, latching it shut once more. Shadow followed him back toward the house, his steps lighter now, his tail wagging faintly for the first time. The night air was still cold, but the warmth between man and dog was undeniable. For the first time in years, the ranch didn't feel so empty. It felt like the start of something new.